This is the unknown zone, where the secrets of war lie buried beneath the ruins of history, where greed became power, and power turned into legend. In the final days of the Second World War, as the walls of the Third Reich began to crumble, another war began, one hidden beneath the smoke and rubble, not for territory, not for ideology, but for gold. This is the story of Nazi gold, the lost treasure of the Third Reich, a fortune built on conquest and corruption, a fortune that vanished in the chaos of defeat and became one of the greatest mysteries of modern history. The roots of that fortune lie deep in Hitler's rise to power. When the Nazi Party seized control of Germany in 1933, the nation was crippled by the Great Depression. Factories were idle, the banks were failing, and the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany economically strangled. To rebuild the empire, the regime needed money, and they found it in plunder. From the beginning, Hitler's economic machine was designed not only to produce, but to seize. Each military conquest became a financial operation. When German troops entered Austria in 1938, the first act wasn't to raise the swastika. It was to empty the vaults. The Austrian National Bank was stripped of more than 100 tons of gold, its reserves absorbed into the Reichsbank in Berlin. The same story repeated itself across Europe. In Czechoslovakia, the Nazis demanded access to the central bank in Prague, and within days, every bar of gold had been shipped to Berlin. When the Germans invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Poland, they looted not only banks, but entire economies. Trains loaded with bullion, coins, and stolen currency moved west to east under the cover of war. By 1941, the Nazi war machine had become a predator that devoured wealth as efficiently as it consumed lives. Factories were dismantled, currencies replaced, and art collections catalogued for shipment to Germany. The Reichsbank under Walter Funk became the beating heart of that plundered empire, the treasury of stolen nations. But gold was not only seized from countries, it was taken from people. In concentration camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, the Nazis extracted gold from the teeth, jewelry, and personal belongings of millions of victims. The SS melted these into bars, which were delivered directly to the Reichsbank and recorded under false accounts. Each bar was another silent witness to atrocity. By the height of the war, Germany had amassed billions in stolen gold, a fortune that financed its armies, its weapons, and its dreams of domination. But as the Allies closed in during 1944, that treasure became a liability. The bombing of Berlin intensified. Railroads were shattered, cities destroyed, and the Reichsbank's vaults no longer safe. Hitler's empire was burning, and its leaders began to hide the evidence of their crimes and their wealth. In March 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin, das Tor, evacuation of the Reich's remaining gold began. Under orders from Reichsbank President Walter Funk and SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, gold bars, coins, and foreign currency were packed into convoys and sent south. Their destination, Bavaria and Austria, regions still under German control and home to vast networks of salt mines and tunnels perfect for concealment. One of these locations would later become infamous, the Merkers salt mine in Thuringia. It was there, deep underground, that the Nazis hid some of their most valuable treasures: 8,198 gold bars, millions in foreign banknotes, and priceless works of art looted from across Europe. The tunnel stretched for miles, and the treasure was buried behind sealed doors and camouflage barriers. In April 1945, U.S. troops of the Third Army, advancing under General George S. Patton, discovered the mine. Inside, they found a vault of unimaginable wealth, crates stacked from floor to ceiling, stamped with the eagle of the Third Reich. Photographs taken by the soldiers show the gleam of gold under electric lights, a silent monument to years of greed. They had uncovered the economic heart of Hitler's regime. But while the discovery at Merkers stunned the world, it was only a fragment of the treasure that had vanished. Dozens of other convoys had been dispatched, their contents lost or never accounted for. Entire trains disappeared into mountain tunnels as the Allies advanced. Some were destroyed, others were hidden so well that they've never been found. From the first days after the war, rumors spread like wildfire. In taverns across Bavaria and Austria, locals whispered about trucks buried in forests, crates dumped in lakes, and trains sealed inside tunnels. One tale told of the Nazi gold train, said to be carrying hundreds of tons of bullion and art, bound for Switzerland, that vanished in the Polish mountains near Leipzig. Treasure hunters would search for decades, but the truth remained buried, somewhere between fact and myth. Meanwhile, the Allied command worked feverishly to locate as much of the missing gold as possible. They created a task force known as the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Program, later immortalized as the Monuments Men. Their mission was to find and return the stolen art, currency and gold that had fueled the Nazi regime. They recovered Michelangelo sculptures, Da Vinci paintings, and crates of bullion hidden in castles and mines. But even as Europe was catalogued piece by piece, billions in gold and valuables remained unaccounted for. The question haunted investigators for decades. Where did the rest of Hitler's fortune go? Some pointed to Switzerland, whose banks had secretly laundered Nazi gold throughout the war, accepting deposits under false names. Others suspected Argentina, where many SS officers fled after 1945, carrying wealth smuggled through Spain and Italy via underground escape routes, the rat lines. There are credible reports of Nazi-marked gold appearing in South American vaults long after the war's end. Still others believe the treasure never left Europe, that it lies hidden beneath the lakes of Austria, sealed within abandoned mines, or buried in the forests near Berchtesgaden. The deeper one digs, the more the mystery grows. The story of Nazi gold is not only a search for treasure, it's a search for accountability, a quest to understand how greed, ideology, and power fused into one of the darkest forces of the 20th century. Each gold bar, each missing crate, carries the weight of millions of lives stolen by an empire that believed it could buy eternity. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the fighting ended, but another kind of war had just begun. A war fought not with bullets or tanks, but with documents, rumors, and secrets. The world had to rebuild from the ashes of the Third Reich. But beneath those ashes lay a question that no one could answer. Where had all the gold gone? In the chaos of the final months of the war, more than half of the Reichsbank's gold reserves had vanished. The Allies had recovered vast amounts from the Merkers salt mine, yet records showed billions more unaccounted for. For intelligence agencies, this was more than just treasure hunting. It was a matter of national importance. The missing gold could finance underground Nazi networks, fund political movements, or reshape post-war Europe in secret. So began one of the largest financial manhunts in history. The first leads came from captured SS officers. Interrogations revealed that in the final days of the war, convoys of trucks and trains carrying gold, art, and cash had been sent south toward Austria. The idea was simple: hide the wealth in secure Alpine strongholds, then use it to rebuild the Nazi movement once the Allies withdrew. One of the most crucial discoveries came from a captured German officer named Friedrich Rauch. He claimed to have seen crates of gold being loaded onto trucks in Berlin in March 1945 under direct SS supervision. The convoy, he said, had orders to drive to Lake Toplitz in Austria. The lake was surrounded by dense forest and mountains, deep, dark, and almost impossible to access. It was the perfect hiding place. In July 1945, US military intelligence began investigating the rumors. Divers were sent to Lake Toplitz, but the conditions were brutal. The lake plunged hundreds of feet deep, its bottom layered with thick logs and debris. Visibility was nearly zero. Despite weeks of diving, they found only scattered crates filled with counterfeit British currency. Part of Operation Bernhard, the Nazi plan to destabilize the British economy by flooding it with fake money, but no gold. The discovery fueled more speculation. If the Nazis had dumped counterfeit currency there, could the gold have been taken elsewhere nearby? For years, treasure hunters, journalists, and even governments would return to Toplitz. Some claimed to find traces of metal. Others swore they saw crates deep in the mud, but none could prove it. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War began, the hunt for Nazi gold took a new turn. Western intelligence agencies realized that former SS officers and Nazi officials were resurfacing across Europe, living quietly under new identities. Some were known to have access to secret bank accounts in Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina. The money trail, it seemed, had never gone cold. One of the key figures in this hidden network was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Reich. Bormann had managed much of the Nazi state's finances and was rumored to have orchestrated the transfer of gold and assets abroad before Berlin fell. He disappeared in 1945, and his fate remained unknown for decades. But according to declassified intelligence documents, Swiss banks held several accounts believed to be controlled by him or his associates. Some were opened in the names of front companies that later appeared in Argentina and Paraguay. Bormann's ghost haunted investigators for half a century. Every time new Nazi-linked assets surfaced in South America, his name followed. In 1972, human remains found in Berlin were identified as his. But even then, questions lingered. Had Bormann really died in Berlin, or had his double died in his place? And if he had survived, had he used the gold to finance post-war Nazi networks abroad? Switzerland, meanwhile, became the center of the gold mystery. Throughout the war, the Swiss National Bank and several private institutions had bought gold from the Reichsbank. Officially, the Swiss claimed it was legitimate trade. But Allied investigators later discovered that much of the gold had been looted from occupied countries and concentration camp victims. After the war, the Allies demanded that Switzerland return the stolen assets. The Swiss refused, saying they couldn't distinguish Nazi gold from regular deposits. In the 1990s, decades after the war, Swiss banks were finally forced to open their archives. The findings confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Gold bars with Nazi markings had been melted down and restamped, entering global circulation. Some of those bars were later traced to the reserves of other European nations, even to the US Federal Reserve. The gold of the Reich had simply been laundered into the world's economy. But still, billions were missing. The question of where the rest went became a web of conspiracy, greed, and secrecy. In the 1950s and 60s, a series of strange expeditions began. Groups of former soldiers, treasure hunters, and even intelligence agents scoured the Alps, following rumors and half-forgotten maps. Some believed the Nazis had buried trains in sealed tunnels. Others followed stories of underground bunkers filled with treasure guarded by locals, sworn to secrecy. One of the most famous treasure hunts began in Poland, near the town of Wałbrzych. According to local legend, a train carrying gold, art, and documents had entered a tunnel in 1945 and was sealed inside by retreating Germans. In 2015, two men claimed to have discovered its location using ground-penetrating radar. News of the Nazi gold train spread worldwide. Polish officials launched a massive excavation, but after weeks of digging, nothing was found. The mystery remained. Still, not all searches ended in disappointment. In 1983, Austrian divers exploring Lake Toplitz once again recovered sealed Nazi crates. Inside were not gold bars, but detailed records of wartime financial transfers, documents hinting at hidden accounts, and coded shipments to Spain and Argentina. Historians later confirmed that some of those transactions matched with missing Reichsbank gold. And so, the story expanded from Europe to the far corners of the world. In Argentina, stories emerged of German submarines arriving on the Patagonian coast in 1945, months after the war had ended. Local fishermen claimed to have seen U-boats surfacing under cover of darkness, unloading crates onto the beaches near Bariloche, a region known for its strong post-war German presence. Years later, divers exploring the area found the wrecks of two U-boats, U-530 and U-977, both confirmed to have surrendered in Argentina after the war. What they carried remains unknown. Many believed those submarines had smuggled Nazi officials and part of the gold reserves to South America. The Argentine government, under President Juan Perón, was known to have received Nazi fugitives and offered protection in exchange for money. Perón's own bank accounts, according to declassified U.S. reports, showed mysterious deposits in gold bullion during the late 1940s. Could this have been the missing gold of the Reich? By the 1970s, the search for Nazi gold had become an obsession for historians, journalists, and intelligence agencies alike. Each new discovery brought more questions. Each rumor led to another dead end. The truth seemed to dissolve into myth. But what investigators began to realize was that the missing treasure wasn't just buried in mountains or lakes. It was buried in the systems that allowed it to survive. Neutral banks, secret accounts, and silent deals had hidden the legacy of plunder in plain sight. The real treasure wasn't in gold bars. It was in the knowledge of how to hide wealth so well that it would never be traced again. The gold of the Third Reich had become something else, a symbol of power without accountability. It had survived the fall of the empire that created it, and in doing so, it had entered history as one of its most haunting mysteries. In the years that followed the war, the Alps became more than a landscape of beauty. They became a graveyard of secrets. Hidden within their valleys and tunnels lay what many believed to be the final resting places of the Reich's stolen wealth. Caves sealed with explosives, mines walled up in haste, and beneath the silence of mountain lakes, the shadows of forgotten convoys. The Allied intelligence services knew the Nazis had planned meticulously for defeat. They had built elaborate escape networks, and they had hidden treasure across Europe with the same precision they had once used to conquer it. But the sheer scale of that operation, the number of people involved, and the secrecy of its execution made uncovering it almost impossible. By the late 1940s, teams from Britain, America, and France were quietly deployed across Germany and Austria under the codename Safe Haven. Their mission: to trace and recover assets stolen by the Nazis and prevent them from being used to rebuild fascism. But what they discovered was a system of concealment that went far beyond gold. The investigators found coded documents, falsified ledgers, and transfer receipts linking Nazi industries to neutral companies in Switzerland, Spain, Sweden, and Portugal. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy was a financial web stretching across the globe, one that had moved not only gold, but factories, patents, and investments. The Reich had built an underground economy designed to survive defeat. Some of the funds were traced to Swiss banks, but others led to corporate fronts established after the war. German companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Thyssen had dissolved in name, but their assets quietly re-emerged under new identities. The war's financial legacy had transformed itself from looted bullion into legitimate capital. Still, the physical treasure, the crates of gold, jewels, and art, remained missing. And in the villages of Austria and southern Germany, whispers grew louder. Locals spoke of strange military convoys in the spring of 1945, trucks that arrived at night, escorted by SS guards, and disappeared into the mountains. Civilians who approached were shot or vanished themselves. When the war ended, the trucks were gone, but the entrances to nearby mines had been sealed with concrete and dynamite. The most persistent rumors came from the region of Bad Aussee in Austria. This area was a stronghold for high-ranking Nazi officials in the war's final months. It was near here that American troops discovered one of the largest art caches in history. Over 6,500 paintings and sculptures hidden inside the Altossee salt mine, including masterpieces by Michelangelo, Rembrandt, and Vermeer. The art was found, but many believed that before the Allies arrived, shipments of gold and currency were moved elsewhere. The tunnels beneath the Alps were endless, many undocumented, built during the war as weapons factories and storage depots. Some were so deep that even today their full extent remains unknown. For decades after 1945, explorers and intelligence agents returned to the region. Some searches were official, others private. Few spoke publicly about what they found. One of the earliest post-war treasure hunters was a former German engineer named Karl Hammer. In the 1950s, he began documenting stories of Nazi convoys moving through the Salzkammergut region in Austria. He interviewed witnesses who claimed to have seen crates marked with the Reichsbank seal being buried under SS guard. Hammer published his findings in a series of reports that caught the attention of both journalists and Western intelligence services. His work led to expeditions into the mountains, where search teams uncovered sealed tunnels, empty crates, and fragments of melted gold leaf, evidence that something valuable had once been there. But the gold itself remained elusive. Every discovery deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Then, in the 1960s, declassified U.S. Army intelligence reports added new layers to the story. One report described how Nazi officials, including SS officers from the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, had transferred crates labeled as museum property to remote Alpine areas before Germany's surrender. The contents were never recovered. Another report mentioned intercepted radio messages between Nazi officers discussing Operation Regenbogen, a coded plan involving the disposal of valuable materials if capture was imminent. To some, this was evidence that the gold had been deliberately hidden or destroyed to prevent Allied seizure. But others believed the operation was a diversion, that the real shipments had been smuggled out long before. Several credible accounts suggested that by late 1944, gold and art were already being moved through Italy into Switzerland, where sympathetic bankers provided new identities and false ledgers for the deposits. When the Reich collapsed, the paper trail was erased, and the gold effectively became untraceable. The scale of the deception stunned post-war investigators. The Reich had used the same genius that built its military to hide its wealth, transforming robbery into an invisible empire. Yet not all of the Nazi treasure was destined to remain buried. In 1976, Austrian authorities reopened part of a sealed tunnel network near Bad Gestin after hikers discovered collapsed entrances. Inside, investigators found rusted ammunition boxes, rotted uniforms, and, most intriguingly, fragments of currency and melted gold. The find reignited interest in the Nazi gold mystery, drawing journalists and treasure hunters from around the world. Among them was an American journalist named William Zabel, who spent 2 decades investigating the story. Zabel interviewed local witnesses, former soldiers, and intelligence officials. He concluded that the missing Nazi gold was divided into multiple caches, each hidden separately by SS officers to prevent capture. According to his theory, these caches stretched from Austria to northern Italy, linked by the same network of mountain tunnels used by retreating German troops. Zabel's research led to one of the most ambitious searches ever conducted, a joint Austrian-American expedition in the late 1980s. The team used advanced ground radar to map sealed tunnels under the Alps. They discovered vast underground chambers, some flooded, others deliberately collapsed. One contained remnants of wooden crates and metal straps consistent with gold bar packaging. But again, no treasure was recovered. For modern historians, the absence of physical proof has never erased the mountain of evidence. Documents, witness accounts, and wartime records all confirm that the Reich hid enormous quantities of wealth during its collapse. What remains uncertain is how much was recovered, how much was stolen again after the war, and how much still lies buried beneath rock and water. The gold of the Third Reich became not just a mystery, but a legend, one that continues to inspire explorers and fortune seekers even today. Every few years, a new story surfaces. A diver claims to have found a sunken vault. A farmer uncovers strange metal boxes, or a government quietly funds an excavation in the Austrian wilderness. Most turn up nothing, but every rumor keeps the legend alive. For many, it's not just about treasure, it's about closure. The gold represents something far greater. The stolen wealth of millions of victims, the proof of crimes still echoing through time. And as long as it remains missing, the shadow of that empire will never fully fade. When the guns of World War II fell silent, the world believed the Nazi Empire had finally been destroyed. Its armies shattered, its cities reduced to rubble, its leaders dead or captured. But in the shadows, The Reich did not end. It adapted. What could not survive in open daylight began to live again underground. This was the hidden war after the war, a web of secret routes, false identities, and covert alliances that allowed Nazi wealth and many of its architects to escape justice. At its center were the same men who had once built the empire of plunder, now fighting not for Germany but for survival. As the Allies occupied Germany, thousands of Nazi officials vanished. Some fled disguised as refugees. Others simply disappeared into the confusion of post-war Europe. But the most powerful had help, from sympathetic priests, businessmen, and even intelligence officers. The escape routes they used would become infamous. They were called the rat lines. The rat lines were networks of safe houses, forged documents, and smuggling channels stretching from Germany and Austria through Italy and Spain to South America and the Middle East. The routes were built by Nazi sympathizers and Catholic clergy who believed they were helping anti-communist refugees, or who were bribed with stolen gold to look the other way. One of the most significant of these rat lines began in Austria, near Salzburg, and ran through the Tyrolean Alps into Italy. From there, fugitives passed through Rome, aided by a small but effective network within the Vatican's refugee offices. They were provided with Red Cross papers and travel documents issued under false names. From Italian ports like Genoa, ships carried them to new lives across the ocean. Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Brazil became sanctuaries for former SS officers, industrialists, and Nazi collaborators. President Juan Perón of Argentina personally welcomed them, offering citizenship in exchange for money, intelligence, and technology. With them came part of the Reich's stolen wealth, gold bars, diamonds, and currency quietly smuggled across borders and oceans. By the late 1940s, entire German communities had formed in South America. In remote mountain towns like San Carlos de Bariloche, one could hear German spoken as often as Spanish. Behind closed doors, men with new names and unspoken pasts rebuilt their lives. They opened factories, shipping companies, and banks. Some even resumed political activity. Quietly, cautiously, but always with funding that seemed to appear from nowhere. That money, investigators believed, came from Nazi gold. In 1947, the newly formed U.S. intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, soon to become the CIA, began tracing financial movements connected to former German officials. They discovered that enormous sums of money were being transferred through Swiss and Spanish banks to accounts in Argentina and Uruguay. Much of it came from frozen assets seized at the end of the war, but later released under questionable circumstances. It became clear that the Nazi financial empire hadn't vanished. It had simply gone silent. One name appeared again and again in post-war intelligence reports: Otto Skorzeny. He had been one of Hitler's most trusted commandos, the man who had rescued Mussolini from captivity in 1943. After the war, Skorzeny escaped capture and re-emerged in Spain, where he built a network of former SS officers, mercenaries, and industrialists. From Madrid, he coordinated logistics for Nazi fugitives escaping to South America. His organization, known as Odessa, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, or Organization of Former SS Members, became a legend in itself. Odessa's purpose was simple: to protect former SS officers, help them escape prosecution, and manage the hidden wealth of the Reich. To fund this, Skorzeny and his associates tapped into gold reserves hidden during the war. much of it recovered from caches across Austria and Bavaria. The gold was melted down, re-stamped, and sold through intermediaries in Spain and Portugal. From there, the money flowed into businesses across Europe and Latin America. For decades, Western intelligence agencies debated whether Odessa truly existed or was simply a myth born of rumor and fear. But declassified documents and testimonies suggest that something very real operated under that name, or under several names, using the remnants of Nazi capital to rebuild power networks far from Germany's ruins. By the early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, the lines between enemy and ally blurred. The United States and its allies began recruiting former Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers to fight a new threat: the Soviet Union. Men who had once served Hitler now worked for the West under new identities. Programs like Operation Paperclip and Project 63 brought them to America, while others were absorbed into NATO's intelligence infrastructure in Europe. And with them came information about secret gold caches, wartime smuggling, and hidden assets. Some used that knowledge for profit. Others sold it to the highest bidder. A few used it to buy their freedom. In 1952, British intelligence compiled a confidential report titled Project Safe Haven: Final Assessment. It concluded that substantial portions of Nazi wealth were successfully concealed in neutral territories, particularly Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina. The report also warned that these funds have since been reinvested in industrial enterprises and financial institutions, forming a continuing influence on post-war economics. In other words, the Reich had died, but its money lived on. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was how easily stolen wealth was legitimized. Swiss banks accepted deposits without questioning their origin. Spanish and Portuguese companies laundered gold into the market. And in South America, governments eager for foreign capital turned a blind eye to the past. The system rewarded silence. By the 1960s, the trail of the original gold had grown cold. Some caches were rumored to have been found by private explorers. Their discoveries hushed up to avoid legal complications. Others were likely stolen again, sold, or absorbed into state treasuries without acknowledgement. Each missing shipment told a different story: greed, survival, or both. But one truth remained constant. The wealth of the Third Reich had not been destroyed. It had transformed from bullion and banknotes into influence and opportunity. The men who once served Hitler had learned to hide behind corporations, banks, and front organizations. The Nazi empire of gold had become an invisible empire of power. In 1997, half a century after the war, Swiss banks faced international lawsuits demanding the release of dormant accounts linked to Holocaust victims and Nazi assets. Under pressure, the banks declassified thousands of records. Among them were transactions from 1944 and 1945, showing large gold deposits from the Reichsbank and private German entities, all made just before Germany's collapse. Billions of dollars in modern value had quietly crossed borders, ensuring the Reich's wealth would survive its destruction. These revelations reignited old questions, not only about where the gold had gone, but about who had helped it move. Governments, banks, and corporations found themselves facing a truth that had been buried for 50 years. And for many survivors and descendants of the war's victims, it was proof of what they had always known, that justice, like the gold, had been hidden. By the turn of the century, The search for Nazi gold was no longer about treasure. It had become a search for truth, a way to expose how far greed, secrecy, and power could reach, and how deeply they could bury the past, the mountains, the lakes, the tunnels. They may still hold the physical remains of that stolen empire. But the real gold, the invisible fortune that passed from the hands of tyrants into the world's financial veins, will likely never be recovered. It changed form, it changed owners, and it changed history. Decades have passed since the last shot of the Second World War echoed across Europe. The cities have been rebuilt, the nations have healed, but some wounds never truly closed. Among them, the mystery of the gold that vanished when the Reich fell. What began as a hunt for missing treasure became something far more profound, a reflection of how power, greed, and secrecy can survive even in defeat. The gold of the Third Reich may never be fully found, but its shadow still moves quietly through the pages of modern history. After 1945, Europe entered a new world, one divided by the Cold War. The focus shifted from the crimes of the past to the politics of survival. Governments turned their attention to rebuilding and to resisting the Soviet threat. In that atmosphere, the search for Nazi gold lost urgency. Files were sealed, investigations ended, and questions were quietly forgotten. But the truth never disappeared. The gold had not vanished into thin air. It had simply changed form. Some of it lay in deep lakes and mountain caverns. Some of it rested in Swiss vaults under assumed names. And much of it had already been converted into influence, power, and capital that shaped the post-war world. By the 1950s, many former Nazi businessmen and bankers were quietly reintegrated into West Germany's new economy. They used their connections and, in some cases, their stolen wealth to rebuild industries that became central to the German miracle. Companies that had once produced weapons for the Reich now built cars, steel, and technology for the new Europe. The same financial networks that had hidden Nazi gold now financed reconstruction. It was not a conspiracy. It was survival disguised as progress. The world was too eager to move on, too afraid to reopen the wounds of war. But for those who had lost everything, for the millions of families whose homes, art, and heirlooms had been stolen, the story of the missing gold was personal. They wanted more than answers. They wanted justice. In the decades that followed, survivors, journalists, and investigators reopened the archives and followed the paper trails. They uncovered accounts, documents, and transactions that led to revelations the world could no longer ignore. Swiss, Austrian, and French banks faced lawsuits over dormant wartime accounts. Museums returned looted artworks to families. Governments launched new inquiries into missing national treasures. Each recovery was a victory, but also a reminder of how much had been taken and how much remained buried. In 1997, more than 50 years after the war, an international tribunal released a report on Nazi gold. It concluded that at least $550 million worth of looted gold, billions in today's value, had passed through neutral countries during the war. A portion had been recovered, but most of it had vanished through private channels and silent deals. The report named banks, governments, and companies that had profited, but it stopped short of full accountability. Too much time had passed. Too many secrets had been traded for peace. That same year, under pressure from survivors and historians, Swiss banks agreed to pay $1.25 billion in reparations to Holocaust victims and their families. It was a rare moment of reckoning. But even then, no one could say how much gold was still missing, or how many hands it had passed through since 1945. Today, the search for Nazi gold continues in whispers. Each generation uncovers a new rumor. A sealed bunker found by hikers in Austria, a diverse sonar reading in a mountain lake, a document discovered in a forgotten archive. The hope of finding the last remnants of the Reich's treasure still draws explorers, historians, and adventurers. But even if the gold is found, it can never repay what was lost, because the true cost of that treasure wasn't counted in money. It was counted in lives. Every bar of gold, every stolen artwork, every hidden crate was paid for by human suffering. The treasure of the Third Reich was built not on wealth, but on tragedy. In 2018, researchers revisiting Austrian archives uncovered a series of coded telegrams dated April 1945. They contained instructions for SS units to secure critical assets for future reconstruction. No details were given, but the messages confirmed what many had long believed, that the hiding of Nazi wealth had been a deliberate, organized effort, not random chaos. Those critical assets were never recovered, and perhaps they never will be, because maybe that was the true intention, not to retrieve the gold, but to ensure it was never found, to leave behind a legend powerful enough to outlive the men who created it, a myth that would forever blur the line between history and mystery. When we speak of Nazi gold today, we're not just talking about treasure. We're talking about the legacy of power, how greed shapes nations, how silence buys freedom, and how even the richest empires can fall, leaving behind only questions. Every sealed tunnel, every hidden vault, every lake that guards its secret is a monument not to wealth, but to warning. A reminder that corruption does not die with those who wield it. It only waits. Beneath the surface of history, in the shadows of the past, the story of Nazi gold ends where it began, not in triumph, but in mystery. The gold that once fueled tyranny became scattered across the world, dissolving into the systems it once sought to destroy. And though the Reich itself lies buried in ruins, its treasure, its symbol of greed and ambition, remains a ghost that refuses to rest. Perhaps it still lies beneath the cold waters of Austria. Perhaps it sits, unmarked, in the vault of a foreign bank. Or perhaps it's already been melted into the gold that circulates in the world today. Worn, traded, and forgotten. But one thing is certain. The gold of the Third Reich will always carry the weight of the past. It will always be a reflection of what humanity can lose when greed becomes ideology and silence becomes profit. This was the unknown zone, where history is not just remembered, it is uncovered, where the secrets of war whisper through time and the echoes of empire still gleam in the dark, because some treasures were never meant to be found.